There we go. Hey, friends, welcome back to the Peace Now podcast. We're here today with my friend Sarah Mastros. Hi, Sarah. How are you?
Hello, I am very well. Thank you for having me.
I am really excited for this conversation.
Me too.
And I wanted to ask, we've been asking our guests
hmm
this question, this starting question, which is about absorption. And so I'm curious, what has been absorbing you recently? Like, what has been at the top of your heart and mind, and what's been getting you
Oh,
up?
that's such a good question. And I know probably this isn't the answer that I should be giving, but I'm going to say it. The truth is, the last couple weeks, I have really been in like a creative funk. Like it has been hard for me to get absorbed in anything recently.
Mhm.
And I feel like at one part of me like doesn't want to admit that and like be vulnerable, but I also feel like I think it's good for people to know that like sometimes everybody is in a place where they're like not absorbed. So the truth is what has been absorbing me lately is just nonsense, paperwork and taxes and things, and I've really been like sort of struggling. But I think that like we all as creative people go through those phases, right? And I know for me, like I guess I give thanks to the muses that I'm pretty confident that I'm sort of, about 2 weeks is as long as I'm usually in such a funk and it'll pick back up. Right. But I sometimes find that like it's better to like kind of give myself that time when I can. Because I used to, when I was younger, like really like berate myself, like, oh, Sarah, you're so lazy. What is wrong with you? Go, 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 go. And now I feel like I know that if I just kind of like can like accept that like maybe I'm not going to be that productive or creative this week, right? Then that next week it'll start to come back. That being said, in a bigger time scale, like over the last few months, I've been really digging into this Hebrew manuscript called Sefer HaOtot, which is a manuscript of planetary pentacles,
Mhm.
which are a kind of medieval wizard diagram, Hebrew medieval wizard diagram
Mhm.
that are mostly known from like relatively corrupt, which I mean just in like a linguistic manuscript sense and not in like a moral sense at all, but these corrupt Christian manuscripts where they're Hebrew diagrams being copied by a series of people, many of whom are not Hebrew literate, and you could tell. But I found this Hebrew manuscript of them that I've been working with, and that's been really exciting for me because I am a giant
Okay. Yeah.
nerd.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. So I'm really grateful to hear about your funk. Because the
It
vulnerability.
happens. It's
Yeah.
winter.
Yeah. It's winter where we're at in the Northern Hemisphere. And um, yeah, I'm hearing you talk a little bit about creative process. So maybe we could linger on that a little bit. And so I heard you talking about the muses, which is some spirit entities I like to work with too.
Yeah, so I think you can see there's a painting of the muses above my desk.
Okay.
That's a painting of Hesiod and the muses, right? So when I say the muses, I really mean like muses in a quite literal like Greek mythology sense.
Mhm.
So in Greek, so muses are spirits of inspiration. They're the daughters of the goddess of memory, Mnemosyne, who is really like we would translate her name as memory, but you have to remember that like that's memory in a culture where writing doesn't exist yet, right? Where memory really means like all arts of the mind, right? And that's the mother of the muses. And they're the goddesses of inspiration, like our English word museum is named after them. And so they're really close to my heart. Like they're a source that I turn to for inspiration. Um, I'm gonna pause, talk about them for a second and talk about my creative process more broadly, and then I'm gonna come back and talk about sort of how they play into it. So for me, you know, I write, right? Like most of my work involves writing, even the pieces that like, so I write books, but I also like teach courses and stuff. But that is actually also a primarily like writing process, right? Like the kind of teacher I am, I really like, I have very carefully planned lesson plans, like teach this, teach this, teach this in sort of this order, where it's pretty structured and written in advance. Although, as I'm doing right now, I'm also happy to just talk, 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 right? And for me, it's really like I was saying, there's sort of, I think of there as being kind of like three phases to my creative process, which I think correlate mythologically you know, where I live in Pennsylvania, and I think in our English speaking culture broadly, in a way that we inherit as being a fact about England. So even people who live places where this isn't true, we think of there as being 4 seasons, right? In ancient Greece, they really thought of there as being 3 seasons, which is just a fact about their Mediterranean culture, right? And and so the older stories about the muses, sometimes there's 3 of them that correlate with the seasons. Although in sort of post in older stories, still ancient Greece, but less ancient, right? There start to be 9 or sometimes even more of them, right? But for me, there's these 3 phases to my creative work that roughly sort of parallel those 3 mythological seasons. And so there's like the season of like blooming forth, right? And for me, that's the like fun stage of the creative process where I'm like a light with ideas and like I'm getting them out as fast as I can put them down, and it's so fun and like great, right? Like everything's pouring out of me.
Yeah.
And then there's like a harvest phase, right? Which I still enjoy. I enjoy that phase as well, but maybe a little bit less. And for me, that's sort of the beginnings of that phase are basically, you know, my rough drafts are very rough. In fact, let me think about. I actually think what many people would call a rough draft, I would call it like a last outline. Like I actually outline very extensively. So by the time I'm writing, honestly, I have a bullet point for like almost every paragraph, right? Because, and it's because the ideas are coming too fast for me to write them in complete sentences, right? So in that sort of harvest phase, the beginning of that phase starts with like turning bullet points into paragraphs. And the end of that phase is like the very close, like copy editing, which I hate. Like that's actually my least favorite part. And the part that like I try and outsource. Like the, you know, my publisher does a lot of that when I am working with a publisher, but when I self-publish, I have to do all that part, which is definitely my least favorite part. But also I think of that as sort of the part I'm getting paid for. Like that first part, the fun part, I do that for free. Right? But if you want me to turn it from basically like a sloppy blog post into like a book that has been edited or a course or like something where I really carefully thought about the order and the visuals and the poetry part of it, I feel like that's the part I get paid for, right? And then there's this fallow period, right? Where I really just have to rest. And I feel like when I was young, I did not appreciate the value of that phase. But now I know, and also I feel lucky. I think for some people, the phases like are longer. Like I really meant it. Like I, from knowledge of myself, know that like if I just sit with like, I don't even want to call it writer's block because it's not exactly that I'm blocked. It's that I am not enjoying it. Like the joy has just fizzled a little. Like I'm a little burnt out. But I know from experience with myself that like that'll just go away if I just wait it out. Right. And so I think of that as like the winter, the fallow period. Right. And usually I sort of try and juggle multiple projects so that I always have something in each of those phases. Because for me, those phases can go very quick, like day to day. Right. So like I'm never in a funk for more than a couple weeks, but usually I'm only in it for like 2 days. Right. And so if I have multiple projects, then I can kind of switch to whichever phase I'm in. Right. So when I'm in the excited phase, I work on the things that like are still kind of up in the air and in the like development stage. Right. And then when I'm like in what I think of as actually like the sort of in between normal, like grown up regular person stage in the middle. Right. Right. I just get the things done that like are still enjoyable and they're still work, but they're not like I'm not on fire for them. You know what I mean? Like I just do them. And then, right, like there's other projects that I really don't have to deal with too much, right? That I can just let rest. And usually I try and sort of keep all those things in a rhythm. But when we were talking about this right before we went on air, sometimes my rhythm gets messed up and like everything hits all at once and then things go bad.
Yeah.
So I will say right now I've been in a funk a little longer than usual, which I think is like just the time of year. You know what I mean? It was the holidays and I like got out of the rhythm. And also I like, you know, I saw family and that's like I mean, I love my family, right? But it's a lot of travel and it's also like emotionally complicated,
Absolutely.
like everybody's family, right? And so I think that just like threw me off my rhythm, and now I'm trying to catch up and I'm in this funk. But I'm confident it'll turn around in the
Okay.
next.
Yeah.
And so let me talk a second about the muses,
Okay.
right?
Mhm.
So for me, like I am lucky and privileged to have a life where like usually I can just sit in that fallow period for a couple days, even up to maybe a week. But I'm saying I'm now on week 2, and like my life and business will not support me just doing nothing for 2 weeks. Like that is not an option. So when I'm really stuck and I need to like supercharge, the muses really are sort of where I turn for that. Right. And I can sometimes magically sort of jumpstart that flow state
It's like
with
a
that, which I do find helpful.
creative defibrillator or something.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. That's such a great way to think about it. The
But
icon for the muses in my Orphic Hymns grimoire book. Let me see if I can. You would think I would like know exactly where everything is in this book because I wrote it. There it is. Okay. This is the Orphic Hymns are a collection of poetry from ancient Greece,
yeah,
sacred poetry, right? There's 88 of them, and they're each dedicated to like a different god or group of gods. And this is the one for the muses. And so this book is my translation of it. And these are it comes with icons, with images for each one that you can work with. And I really, so they're by Brian Charles, is the artist who did all the illustrations. I really love that illustration of the muses where they're just kind of like massaging your brain and like your eyes start to light up, because that's really how I feel it, is that like when I'm in communion with the muses, there is like a very honestly like physical sensation of them like having their hands in my brain moving things around.
wow.
Yeah. I mean, I
That's
don't want to oversell it, and that maybe, I think it's so hard to talk about magic and mysticism in English because for hundreds of years we burned anybody who talked about it out loud. So we don't have a very good vocabulary for it. So I feel like maybe I didn't fully describe the experience, but that's maybe the best I can do, is that there really is like an almost like electrical tingle sensation
yeah,
of it moving around in there.
yeah. I think, Sarah, I want to stay this idea of spiritual entities like the muses,
Mm-hmm.
that you're kind of communing with, I think is really evocative, no pun intended. And then you've written the Orphic Hymns book where we can explore with the muses and different classes of spirits, and then a recent book on Solomonic magic. But before we get into that, yeah, this one, the Sorceries, Solomon, I wanted to kind of take a left turn and
Sure.
linger with this thing of, again, left turn, no pun intended. You'll see in a second. So your cycles, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
creative. I was thinking of it as kind of like birth, death, rebirth too, a little bit. So you've got like the seasons
I
and
think it's a little more like birth, growth, death,
gotcha.
and then back to birth,
Yeah, yeah,
maybe. But I would not think of rebirth and birth as like two separate cycles.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because you also mentioned in our pre-interview
Mm-hmm.
Satan,
Sure.
Satanism. And I just have this thing I've been thinking about a lot. And you were talking about the Greek. And so you're talking
Sure.
about cycles, Greeks, and then you mentioned Satan or Lucifer. I think of Lucifer. And one thing I noticed about Christianity and the three of the dominant monotheistic religions is God, there's no succession myth. There's no,
Well, I think that's not. I mean, I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. Certainly in Judaism, like we do have a sort of evolving process. So we would say in Judaism, a lot of times we'll say the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, right? And so there's this extensive commentary, like, why do we say that instead of saying the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob,
Mhm.
right? And it's because it's telling us that, like, as we humans evolve, both in our individual lifetimes, but in this context, like, as like we evolve from like, we translate it Garden of Eden, but the word there means pardes, right? It's the root of our English word paradise. It literally means like a permaculture orchard, but it's often translated as a nursery, the same way we would say like a tree nursery. And there's this dual meaning as like that's also a place where you keep babies, right? So there's this understanding, I think, in Torah, at least in the way Jews read it. Like, I think it's important to understand that like the three monotheisms are like much, much less similar than Christians say they are, right? But like in Judaism, there is definitely, I think, in mainstream Judaism, there's a lot of ways to read it, right? But in mainstream Judaism, there's definitely this understanding that like that as humans evolve and as the world evolves, God also evolves. That like the God of Abraham is not the same as the God of Isaac, who is not the same as the God of Jacob, who is not the same as the God of Moses or the God in our day, right? That there is this continual unfolding,
Yeah.
right? Not just here, but also in the, that creation is not like a single event, right? But rather that God is that thing, like that process, that verb, right? That moment by moment wills, like turns being into becoming, like breathes the universe into being moment by moment and breath by breath. And I think that's like a very mainstream understanding in Judaism.
Okay. So what's your relation to Satanism then? So you're talking about
Well, you know, Satanism is complicated because I didn't grow up Christian. So I've never been Christian. And when we talk about Satanism, like Satanism, okay, I know neither Christians nor Satanists always appreciate this, but Satanism is a kind of Christianity. Like it is a splinter offshoot of Christianity that operates largely in a Christian paradigm, right? So when I say that I'm a Satanist, what I mean is I'm not a dualist. Like I don't think there's like one good God and one bad God and they're at war with each other. But in as much as that is true, I'm definitely on Team Satan. Like I am on the side of liberation and freedom and autonomy,
Mhm.
and not on the side of surrender, which I mean in a very mystic, like taking refuge in surrender way. Like I'm just not on that team. But I'm also not a monotheist, or well, I'm not a dualist, right? So I actually think of the teams as much more complicated than that. But in a Christian paradigm, right, which I don't normally operate in, except that I live in a culture that primarily operates in it,
Mhm.
I'm definitely on the other team.
Okay. What's like yeah, because so there's this like conception of like almost like a dialectic or something, or like this relationship between surrender and like freedom and liberation. And you see that operating within a Christian paradigm.
Yes.
Yeah. And then how would you, with your reading of Judaism, it would like God be like encompass that entire dialectic in
Yeah,
the
yeah, certainly. Just like Isaiah says, right? Like I look, I'm not a rabbi or anything. I mean, maybe this conversation would be cleaner if I could just quote every verse in Torah off the top of my head, and I can't. But there's definitely a verse in Isaiah that goes in English something like I create the light and I form the darkness, I foment war and I make peace, I alone do all these things. So yeah, I think like again, yes, in Judaism we would say all of those things are divine.
Gotcha. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So where was I going with that? Oh, I was just thinking, I think cycles, like my experience of cycles, like I experience like in my life almost a repression of the cycle.
I
Like
think our culture is very much sort of at war with natural cycles. Like I think there's a natural cycle to the year and the day and the seasons that like I think our culture like just doesn't admit is real.
yeah,
Like it's actually ridiculous that people are trying to do the exact same workday in January as they are in
I
July.
know. I thank you
Like
for
it's ridiculous. That's just not how anything fucking works. But
yeah,
what I'm saying is like I feel really lucky and privileged that I'm actually mostly off of clock time and just on like nature time and Sara like
yeah.
I mean I do Zoom interviews like this that happen at a specific time, but like I actually hate them. And when I'm not on book tour, basically, like, I just had a book come out last week, so I'm doing a lot of that sort of thing. But like most of the time, most of the year, like I can cut that down to only 1 or 2 days a week where I have to like be on clock time, and the rest of the time, like I go to sleep when I'm tired, and I wake up when I'm not tired anymore, and I like work when I'm excited to work.
Mhm.
And sometimes when I'm not excited to work because I'm sadly not excited quite enough to actually get things done, and I still live in the real world. So there's all kinds of
Mhm.
stuff like we were saying, like taxes and marketing and washing dishes that like I'm never excited about, but have to get done anyway. But usually I can keep things moving in a way that is like sort of dominated by the like rhythms of nature and the rhythms of just like, I want to say my rhythms, but I mean that's just part of those natural rhythms. But I will also say I think my sort of internal cycles tend to be a little faster than many people's. Like I'm moody, I guess is what we would say. Like I get sad and then happy, but like I'm not usually stuck anywhere for too long.
Yeah, there's a flow to it, like the
Yeah.
season. Yeah. Yeah, and you're talking about, I was just thinking about this today. I was thinking about clocks, and you said clock time, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
difference between a clock and a calendar. You know,
Yes.
a calendar it's qualitative. Like the seasons are more qualitative. Like we have, and like you're saying, in
Yeah.
with a clock, like an hour is an hour in January, or but actually, and this is what's great about magic is a lot of times the magic will use like a lot of the systems I've seen will use like the
Right.
ancient.
Astrological. Yeah, hours. So planetary hours, the way they work is like there's always like and out there's 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, and like in January that means night hours are just long, like
Yeah,
they're longer than 60 minutes, and
yeah.
day hours are shorter. But an hour in traditional systems, like before the invention of clockwork, well, before we gave over our lives to clockwork, like that's what an hour meant. An hour was like 1/12 of the distance from sunrise to sunset, and then 1/12 of the distance from sunset to sunrise. Also, I was just talking about this with somebody else. It's absurd that we live in a world where days change over at midnight.
Mm.
Like, it's so ridiculous. Like, what? Like, clearly the only reasonable times to start a day are either sunset or sunrise. Personally, I'm on team sunset, but like every other time to set your like day to roll over is ridiculous,
Mm.
is my opinion. And similarly, like it's ridiculous that we are claiming the New Year's happens in January.
Mm.
Like I guess I'm a fool, but I feel like it's pretty evident that the New Year's starts in the spring
Yes.
with Fool's
Spring.
New Year, or April Fool's Day, as I suppose we
Oh,
call it now.
yeah.
But like, you know what I mean? That like the spring equinox seems like a pretty normative way to think about the start of the year in the climate where I live, right? Whereas in like in the Levant, right? I think starting it at like the autumnal equinox, which is when like the Hebrew calendar starts,
Mhm.
it makes perfect sense. Like that's when the rains come back, that's when their agricultural year starts. But like nothing starts in January. No wonder I'm in a funk. Like this is obviously not the beginning time,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, this cycle thing, it's cool that we're talking and the qualitative aspect. I think
Yeah.
it's important.
I've been a student asked me to talk about like sort of the magic of winter recently, and that's one of the things. Remember I said I've been kind of like stuck, that's one
Yeah.
of the things I'm stuck on. But today I started working on it, and I was really talking about the difference between like astrological winter, right, or really astronomical winter, right, that's defined by like the how much light there is,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And in that sense, like the darkest time is the winter solstice. But at least where I live, winter, what I really think of as winter, like where you open the door and it like hurts your face and you're like, oh, I don't want to go outside. Like the time where you're like, oh, I should live in a cave. That would be good right now. Like, is just started, right? And our deepest winter where I live is like mid-February.
Yeah.
That's when it's like so cold and there's snow and snow and snow and snow, and you like never see the sun because it's just gray and snowing all the time where I live. And I've really been thinking a lot about the difference between like astronomical winter as a spiritual season and like agricultural winter, right? Which, so you know, we think of astronomical winter as really running like from the autumn equinox to the spring equinox, right? That's when there's more dark than light,
Mhm.
right? But like I think of agricultural winter as basically like from first frost to last frost.
Hmm.
Like as a gardener, those are like, that's when winter starts, is when it freezes and all the green plants, like, you know, they get ice crystals in their cell walls break and they wilt, like they're just done, right, with one overnight frost. And where I live, like first frost and last frost line up really pretty closely with Halloween and May Day.
Hmm.
Like over the last century, I guess the average first frost where I live is October 21st.
Hmm.
But over the last decade, they just a couple months ago, like sort of told us over the last decade, which I had already noticed because I'm a gardener, that like it's moved. So now they're telling us November 8th is our new expected first frost. That's been the average over the last decade. So you can see it's moved really quite dramatically.
Yeah.
Right. And certainly I and everybody else who gardens had already noticed that like growing seasons are getting longer, which is, you know, in a very short-sighted garden way, kind of nice,
Yeah.
but also terrifying on a like existential level, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about sort of how that works, right? And that like that winter, the earth winter, right? The winter that is not really about how dark and light it is, but in its essence, it's about how cold the ground is. Where do you live? Like, do you get snow there?
Yeah. We live in the
Yeah.
city.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess I
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, here, right, it's only, you know, we've had a couple snows, but it's only recently that it's starting to stick because
Yeah.
the ground gets cold enough to like keep it cold. And so, and I think about that delay. Do you know what I mean? That like it's because it got darker and colder, but the air getting cold isn't really like from a natural standpoint what matters. It's the ground getting cold and warming back up, like the water freezing. And so I think a lot about like what it means that we as a culture are so focused on sky time and like not insufficiently focused on like earth time, despite that we like actually live here on earth. Like we do not live in the heavens.
Ooh.
We don't right, like we don't even live, like we live closer to the underworld than the heavens. We live at the very bottom, right, of like the sky,
Yeah.
right? Like we're standing on the earth, right, touching it, feeling it. And I think that for me, I will say like nothing puts me in both a spiritual sense but also a very physical sense, which I think, you know, those aren't really different senses at all. Like gardening really puts me in touch with that sort of great cycle in a way that other things don't. And that great cycle of the seasons, but that is the cycle of like birth and growth and death,
Yeah.
and decomposition and then rebirth. You know what I mean? Like in a Greek metaphor, like Persephone is the goddess who like pushes on seeds to get them to blossom, but she is also the goddess that like pulls the dead things down to decompose in the earth, and like that full cycle.
Yeah. Like a kind of sex and death, Scorpio type energy.
I do not think of Persephone as very like sex related at all,
Okay.
I will say.
The seed.
I meant like plant seeds.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So we're talking
You know,
about,
the thing about not being a monotheist is that like there's a lot of different ones. So like Persephone is like a pretty tight, there's
Mhm.
like pretty tight boundaries. Unlike, remember I was saying like the Jewish God who's just like everything all the
Yeah.
time. Like the Greek gods are really much more, I don't want to say compartmentalized because they're not compartmentalized. Like I know I'm me and you're you because like I have a body and I'm inside of it and you have a body and you're inside of it and there's like space between those two things.
Mhm.
But I feel like for people, right, spirits, but I think the word people and the word spirit mean basically the same thing, right, who don't have bodies or who aren't as tied to their bodies, like the boundaries between them become a lot fuzzier, you know.
Yeah.
I
Like,
waved my hands around in some vague attempt to make that make sense. I don't know if that actually made sense.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Maybe we could bridge that into spirit because, yeah,
Sure.
I do think that identity is an interesting question. Because, yeah, like one way, conventional reality way to think about identity is like I have some kind of continuity, and then I have like an outside, like you're saying, like there's an
Yeah, right.
outside. And then yeah, it like some of the spirits and the myths, they kind of blend. There's less corporeality, but there's like a sense. And so like maybe we could just jump into like the Goetia.
Sure.
You've been working with that. And that's like a thing, like that is a name, it's like a concept, but there's a lot of like moving parts to it. And then you like talked about the muses too. So like
Sure.
spirits, like how do you relate to spirits? And
I relate to spirits that have bodies like human beings or trees.
Mhm.
Uh, Roughly the same way I relate to spirits that don't have bodies, like gods or ghosts, I guess, like as individuals who have their own complex personality and wants and needs that aren't the same as mine. And that communication is what bridges the gap between those things.
Mhm. Yeah, and so this taxonomy and classification, like how do you do it? You know, like how so you labeled there's a few different
Yeah, so here's the thing. I think sometimes people get really like stuck in the weeds in terms of like categorizing spirits.
Mhm.
I think that generally most of the categories that we use to discriminate, I just mean like tell the difference between different kinds of spirits. I think usually what sometimes people ask like what's the difference between like a god and an angel and a demon and a ghost and etc. And I think like actually when we ask those questions, we're not really categorizing. I don't want to get too nerdy about this. We're not really making like an ontological distinction. That is to say, they're not like different species of
Mhm.
things. We're really talking about the relationship that I have with something, right? So, like the same spirit can be one person's God and another person's devil. In fact, my experience is that most of my gods are labeled devils by lots of people, right? That usually we're talking about the relationship between the speaker and the spirit when we are talking about a category of spirit, it's actually a category of a relationship.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting because that might not be intuitive. Like, because
It
some,
took me a while, I think, to sort of come. Yeah, I agree that that is not entirely intuitive.
so it's not like, so demon is not equivalent to tiger because, like, a tiger, whether you have a nice relationship with a tiger or not, you know, it is a tiger, even if
Right.
if it wants to be your friend. Um,
It's complicated because like I said, like in English, for very obvious historical reasons, like we don't have a very robust vocabulary. So
mm,
I am not saying that there like aren't different like species of spirit. There are, right? But I just think most of the time, but I think in order to tell those differences, I actually think you maybe kind of have to be like a specialist. Like
mm,
you do have to like be interacting with spirits a lot and like both have like some like traditional training,
mm,
right? And like just some like book learning almost that you don't have to get from books. Like it's better to get it from people. Like for almost everything, a live teacher is superior to a book in terms of learning. But like there's just like some knowledge you have, but there's also just like an experiential element to it.
mm.
Just like the sense, like, you know, I would trust a like folk healer who'd been practicing for 30 years more than I would trust like somebody right out of medical school.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like there's a combination of experience and like book learning that come together. And I think that's as true in like spirit work as it is in anything else. So there, I do think there are like these different like species distinctions, but usually I just find that's actually not what people are talking about. Like usually for most people in English, the difference between a demon and an angel is essentially whether they like them or not.
Yeah, like the feeling, the experience of encountering the thing.
I mean, not even that usually. Like usually those words are used by people who are not encountering them at all.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Right. But even when you encounter it, I would say, and those two in particular, I would say the difference between a demon and an angel is largely like a political distinction about things that aren't really about humans at all. And they're like ontologically quite similar in a way that like an angel and a ghost, like a spirit of a dead human, are definitely like more ontologically distinct. They're like noticeable features. But I think that being able to tell the difference between those is actually not that easy. Like usually because you never experience them except in a way that is like very mediated by your own self, because they're invisible. It's not like a tiger, right? Where like like I don't know about you. I want to say, I guess I have seen a living tiger like in a zoo, but I don't really like when I imagine tigers, I'm barely even imagining a living animal. I'm imagining like sort of a media portray. I'm imagining like stories of tigers, right? But
Yeah.
certainly, and so like, and that's different than like the way I know squirrels, an animal that I interact with quite frequently, versus the way I know tigers is a very different kind of a knowing,
Mm.
right? And I think most people, when we're talking about like invisible spirits, are sort of more in the like almost mythic category. Like they don't really have any actual experience of it, right? And so they have this idea of them that is built largely out of like stories.
Movies.
But even our experience of them, like it's not mediated by our physical senses so much as it is mediated by like a lot of sort of complex, fuzzy crap where our biases can really like come into play a lot. And so
Mm.
I think that it's harder to differentiate between what that spirit actually is and the like small portion of it that you interact with through this specific kind of relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Totally. It makes a lot of sense. And the taxonomical, it's somewhat boring. I mean,
I'm
there's
nerdy and I like that kind of thing as like a nerd exercise, but I don't find it particularly like useful or enlightening. I just
yeah,
like it like scratches an autism itch sometimes to like put things into neat categories. I enjoy it, but
yeah, and it opens up interesting questions. I mean, so like one ontological similarity is like, well, they don't seem to have bodies, right?
well, wait, between what and what?
Like, well, like any spirit.
So
You know,
I think that's not as true as I used to. So I think a lot of spirits that we think of as disembodied do have bodies that are far away from us. So,
hmm,
like, until I was in the Plutonian cave in Eleusis, which is like one of the main centers of Persephone worship, like, I would have said Persephone didn't have a body.
hmm,
But then I was inside her womb in this particular cave, and she did. She definitely did have a, like, there is a way in which, like, Zeus of Mount Olympus has a body and it's Mount Olympus. And
hmm.
I did not appreciate that. Like, I did not understand that until I was on that mountain,
Oh,
right? And what I'm saying is, particularly Persephone, a goddess with whom I had a very deep relationship, I really didn't understand the physicality of it. But let me talk about that Eleusis experience because I think it's like, no pun, really elucidating. Um, so the modern Greek name for Eleusis is the ancient seat of the Eleusinian mysteries, right? It's a location, like Eleusis is a place. It's called Elefsina in modern Greek, and it's about, I would say by car, it's about an hour south, westish of Athens, right? And so one of the interesting things is that if you just take the bus to Elefsina from Athens, you're actually following almost exactly the like ancient ritual processional way, right? That people would have walked. It's a 3-day walk from Athens to Eleusis, right? And like the highway actually parallels it pretty closely,
hmm.
right? And I don't know why more people don't go there. I will say I've been there twice, and both times it was basically empty. But it's amazing. Like if you're in Greece, it's kind of off the beaten path. Like you kind of have to be like a mythology nerd to go there. Like none of the tourist like normal tours go there, but I don't know why because it's only an hour away from Athens and it's amazing. But every single person I talked to in Athens, the concierge at the hotel, the guy at the grocery store, the cabbie, like everybody I spoke to, when I mentioned that I was going to Elefsina, so it was February. In fact, it was February 20th because it was the day before my birthday. So I know exactly. It's February 20th. And, you know, Greece isn't Pittsburgh. So it's not like what we think of as February, but I mean, it's still February, like it's cold and wet. So in Athens, like I was still wearing a jacket in Athens, right? I didn't need like a giant winter coat, but I definitely had a jacket. Every single person I spoke to was like, oh, it will be spring in Elefsina. Every person I talked to. And that was 100% true. There were full bloomed like poppies, like wildflowers that not like buds, like fully bloomed in Elefsina. And that was my first like, and mythically, they would say that's because that's where Persephone arises in the spring. Like she comes through that specific cave. That's the birth canal of the world, right? The one through which spring emerges. And that is just a physical fact about Elefsina, like that it has a microclimate where spring arrives early. And that is Persephone having a body, right? Like that is an embodied spirit. It's just a body that's so far away that like we hear, like her mythology has become completely disconnected from her body. But having experienced that body, like it was a very different experience, a much, I don't even want to say it was like a deeper, richer experience, but it was definitely an experience that like I had not yet had. And so it really deepened my experience of Persephone. Like I had a transformative, both times I've been at Eleusis were transformative spiritual experiences for me in a way, honestly, without compare. Like I have never, there is no other place I have ever been that for me was like so powerfully an experience of a like sacred place, a magical place than Eleusis. But I'm just saying it's like sacred on my wavelength. Like I've been to many other sacred locations and I can imagine some of them like being more powerful for other people.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Like Avebury, I found quite powerful, but not nearly as powerful. Glastonbury. My brother lives in Southern England, so I've seen a lot of like the Southern England ones. The reason I'm in Europe more frequently than you might imagine is because my brother lives in England.
Living in England. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so there's like there's an aspect of place with Persephone in particular. And it's
Well,
like,
I think with almost all gods, I just think that like we live in a land where like we don't really know the gods of this land, and the gods of our ancestors are far, far, far away.
yeah,
And like we've lost the embodiment aspect of it. But
yeah,
also, I mean, Persephone in particular is a, you know, some gods more than others sort of arise from and abide in the land. And Persephone is one who has a very strong, like, you know, she's the goddess of the underworld and like the emergence of that into the middle world. And that's a very place dependent thing, you know.
mm-hmm.
Like we were talking about, like their seasons are legitimately different than ours.
Yeah. Well, let's maybe shift gears a little bit. And so
Sure.
we're talking about spirits and some philosophy about them and kind of just exploring this thing of spirits. And you've recently written a book,
Mm-hmm.
and I would put it in, like, in my understanding, like in the tradition of like the Goetia, Solomonic magic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like
So,
it's,
Mhm.
no, go ahead.
I was going to ask if you could like sketch that world of Solomonic magic, the Goetia, the history of it, maybe touching on like McGregor Mathers,
Sure.
you know, the main cultural points, and then also kind of situate your work in that constellation or world. Could you help us with that?
Yeah, so let me distinguish first between Goetia and Solomonic magic.
Okay.
So the kind of magic I do is sort of the overlap of those two things, but both of them have instantiations that aren't the other one, right? So let me start with Solomonic magic, right? So Solomonic magic, the way I understand it, is magic that is attributed to Solomon the magician king, like the legendary, the last king of united Israel, right? Like Solomon the magician king, the son of David, right? As a mythic figure, not really as a, I don't think any reasonable and well-educated person believes that what we call Solomonic magic was developed by a literal living human named Solomon in the 10th century BCE, right? Now, I will say I do think that there probably is a historic figure upon whom like the biblical Solomon is based. I think he's probably reigning around 800 BCE, just based on like his relationship. So I'm going to assume most people listening have at least like a vague familiarity with Solomon as a biblical figure, but I'm going to say a couple things. The first one is that like Solomon comes to the throne quite young, right? And that he is famed as a peacemaker. So
Mm.
David was at war with
Mm.
all of Israel's neighbors for most of his reign. But Solomon has a very long reign, right? He begins as a young man and he reigns until he's quite old, right? And through his long reign, he's making peace with basically all of Israel's neighbors. And he is moving Israel from being like a relatively minor kind of cultural backwater to being like a big and important, like economically and culturally important player in like the region, right? So for example, he marries Pharaoh's daughter, right? And by doing so makes peace with Egypt and like establishes this complex cultural relationship, right? So under Solomon, Israel emerges as like this really sort of cultural center, right? Like if you look at a map, it's pretty clear why Israel is going to be a cultural center. Like it's really there's only two land routes out of Africa. There's really only one land route out of Africa, but you can, the Straits of Gibraltar are pretty, you can hop the Straits of Gibraltar, right? But there's only these two ways out. And really you have to go through Egypt and then you have to go through the Levant to get places from there, right? Particularly into Europe or like North Asia, right? There's no cultural transmission from Africa into Europe, particularly Eastern Europe or like Northern Africa, or sorry, Northern Asia, that doesn't go through that region, right? And so Solomon is really mythically at the heart of that, right? And so, like, if you read in Talmud, the rabbis are like constantly complaining about his lack of cultural purity. Like, they would like it if he was less friendly with foreigners, because conservative elements in culture are always opposed to that sort of thing, right? But Solomon is very syncretic, right? Like he introduces lots of foreign practices in a magical way and in a mythic way and in like other kinds of cultural ways as well, right? And so Solomonic magic begins there, right? Solomon is famously sort of multicultural and famously wise, right? Like those are the sort of legendary qualities we ascribe to Solomon. And over time, that wisdom turns into a legend of him as an exorcist. So his father, David, was also an exorcist, right? Like in that culture, the distinction between an exorcist and a healer is a pretty fine distinction, right?
Yeah.
Like there's sort of this continuum from what we would call like a physical doctor through like maybe like a mental and spiritual healer through exorcism, that they would call that whole category exorcism, right? And David is famous as an exorcist, but not really as a magician. Whereas Solomon, like he learns that from his father, but then he learns this whole like astrotheology from the Queen of Sheba and from Nathan the prophet and from other sources, right? Where he is also like in magical communion with other spirits, right? So legendarily, like he had an army of demons or an army of jinn, right, who helped him build the temple, for example, right? And that's what I think of as like the core myth of Solomonic magic, right? So over time, that mixes with this Babylonian astrotheology that is coming in like from the buff originally, right? Like the formation of Solomonic magic, right, is really this combination of like Egyptian priestcraft, Babylonian astrotheology, and like Levantine spirit practice, right? And then a little bit later, right, you add in this Greek goetic practice, right? So this Greek spirit-based quasi-shamanic sorcery element, right? And all these things foment, right? And at this point, right, sort of, so this is happening like in late antiquity, really, right? It's starting off, you have all these many roots that are really coming together into this strong sort of like coherent form of magic, right? Starting in late antiquity, maybe around like 200 or 300 BCE and running until maybe like 1000 CE when the Eastern Roman Empire starts to fall apart, right? So like when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're talking about the fall of the Western Rome, the Latin Roman Empire, but all of this is happening in the East. Everybody in this story is speaking Greek, not Latin, right? And that goes, I think that sort of transitions into the Babylon or to the Byzantine Empire, right? There's less of a fall and more of like a slower transformation, right? Islam emerges, and at this whole time, right? So we've got these pillars, right? Christianity emerges, right? Islam emerges in this sort of mixing pot, right, of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Middle East, right, and North Africa mixing together, right? And Solomonic magic is really growing out of there, and then it starts to branch off again in like the 1100s, right? And so we get these different sort of systems where like the Christian Solomonic magic that I think is what most people are familiar with when they talk about Solomonic magic, they're talking about like late medieval, early Renaissance Christian sort of like wizard. So for people who don't know a lot about the history of magic, if you like imagine a wizard in like a tower, like drawing some symbols in a circle and like speaking some Greek and some Hebrew and some Latin, like that's the kind of magic we're talking about when we say Solomonic magic, right? Is that late medieval, and that's sort of the late medieval, early Renaissance Christian variety. But there's also this parallel Muslim track and this parallel Jewish track and this parallel quasi-pagan star worshipping track, basically, right? And so those are going to start to come together again, right? After having split apart, they start to come together again in Sepharad is what we would call it in Hebrew, right? In Muslim-controlled Spain and Portugal, right? And there's a lot more cultural mixes. So those cultures are trying to, those three strands we've been talking about are starting to blend back together again. And like that's where a lot of the Solomonic magic that sort of we talk about comes from, right? And then it like, including the Pentacles, which are what my book is about, right? So most of my colleagues would say that, all right, sorry, this is a little complicated history, or maybe too in the weeds. Let me try and summarize. Okay, so we generally know about Solomonic magic, like in modern English-speaking magical communities. Most people are talking about these Renaissance grimoires, right? Including the Key of Solomon, which is sort of like the most famous book of Solomonic magic. And we talk about it as if it's a single book, but it's not. It's like a whole family of closely related books. And depending how blurry you let those boundaries get, the very earliest versions of it are something called the Hygromantia, right? Which is a Greek text, like a Greek spirit sorcery text, right? Where you get like, it's a spirit catalog is what we would call it, right? Where you have like a list of spirits and like what they're good for and some instructions for making contact with them, right? It's like a spirit Rolodex almost, right? And that slowly grows and changes, right? And part of the Key of Solomon, the way most people first learn the Key of Solomon is from, you'd think I would know this exact date, let's say 1890-ish, edition by someone named Samuel Little McGregor Mathers, right? S.L. Mathers, who founds an organization, who helps found an organization called the Golden Dawn, right? So his edition of the Key of Solomon, he has recently married. At the time that he is putting that edition out, he has recently married someone whose name prior to marriage was Mina Bergson. She changes her name to Moina Mathers. She's Henri Bergson's little sister. She comes from like a quite, yeah, I don't know. It's shocking to me that like, but I mean, I don't mean it's surprising that you don't know that. Nobody seems to know that, but like, it makes a lot of S.L. Mather's work makes a lot more sense when you understand that his wife, if you look at like a chronology of S.L. Mather's work and you read it carefully, you will notice that there's this one point around like, you know, late 1880s where he suddenly seems like he knows a lot more Hebrew and Kabbalah, and also like he's just got maybe like this more sophisticated understanding. Like he suddenly develops a total appreciation for Jewish magic, and that happens when he marries Mina Bergson, the youngest daughter of a quite prominent Jewish family. Like her great grandmother Temerel Bergson, like helped to found Hasidism. Right, like so there's every reason to believe that Mina Bergson got like a quite solid Jewish education, right? And so the Key of Solomon in Mather's edition has a book 1 and a book 2. I believe both of those books were probably original. I mean, those books are based on, again, a variety of closely related manuscripts. But I think those manuscripts originate in Latin and are primarily written by and for Christians. But in between the two books, there's this chapter that's neither in book 1 nor book 2, which is immediately maybe a hint that this piece is like imported into this text separately, right? Of these Hebrew pentacles. And I'm just going to show people who don't know what I'm talking about, like what they look like. So that's just kind of like a random example. They're just Hebrew amulets.
Of Shadi Elohim.
Of Shaddai. Yeah, and of Shaddai Elohim. I mean, that's this particular one, but I'm just saying they're a kind of wizard diagram in Hebrew. Like they're definitely in Hebrew. No matter what language the manuscript they're in is in, they're almost always in Hebrew, right? And so like, I think that's a good clue that they're probably Jewish in origin. There's reasons to believe they have a different origin than the rest of the text. And they're very similar to other kinds of Hebrew. Like they're much more similar to like, you know, Christian magical texts have this tendency to like really not cite any sources. And I understand why. It's because all this information is illegal in Christian Europe. And so not citing sources, that's the same as not naming names, right? Like I understand why they're doing it. But sorcery isn't illegal in Judaism. So Jewish and Hebrew manuscripts are like much more prone to just like telling you, like, I wrote this book, my name is Isaac, I copied it from this guy named Judah, his father's name is this, here's where he lives. Oh, and here's what his book said, but I'm going to tell you I think that's wrong because this other book said this, and I think this is wrong because this text says blah blah blah. Like there's just a lot more of that information because it doesn't have to be secret, right? And so I believe that the Pentacles, which are what my book is about, those like Hebrew seals that I'm talking about, I believe they probably originated in like 12th century Sepharad. That is in a Jewish Hebrew literate community in Muslim-controlled Iberia. But I will say many of my colleagues say that they originated in Christian Europe. I just think they're wrong. And like, I will say over the last several decades, the pendulum is sort of swinging toward agreeing with me. So I think if you check back in 20 years, you'll find out that I was right. That's my opinion. Things are going that way. Yeah, right. And so those are the Pentacles that I'm translating in this book, are Mather's edition of the Pentacles. So what I was saying is like these Christian grimoires, including Mather's grimoire, like Mathers would not contextualize himself as Christian, but I would contextualize him as Christian, right? There, or at least he has a lot of Christianity in him in like an unexamined way, right? Like they're corrupt, like, and he doesn't provide any explanation for them. Like there's really no explanation of like where these pentacles came from, or like why they are constructed the way they are, or even really what you're supposed to do with them. Like there's just not that much information. And so I expanded out all of that. And so I first started working with these pentacles when I was about 15, right? So about 30 years ago. And they had words on them. So it seemed pretty important to know what those words meant. And yet none of the books I was finding could tell me what the words meant. And as I like got more involved and met more people, none of the experts could either. Like I would be like, hey, what does this word mean on this one? And most of them would say, I don't know. Totally fine answer, right? But some of them would say it doesn't matter. And like, I think it does matter. I think it does matter, right? So I finally just, over those 30 years, I just like figured out what all the words meant, which is difficult because like a lot of Hebrew magic, some of them are in code. Like there's a variety of kinds of Kabbalistic codes that are used, and they have a transmission history of people who aren't fluent in Hebrew, so sometimes they're corrupt. And you have to like look at other manuscripts and talk to spirits and et cetera to like really figure it out. But so I laid out all my findings in this book. Here's what this, like there's 44 pentacles. Here's what every word on this one says. Here's how I use it. Here's why I think these words are on this one, et cetera. And that's how a book about 44 pentacles is 270 pages long. Like that's how I spun up 270 pages out of 44 pentacles, that I have a lot to say. So I talk about what I translate all the names, right? Because in Hebrew magic, and I would say in magic generally, the distinction between a magic word and a magic name, I really think of all names as words and all words as names in a magical sense, and also in every other sense, but particularly in magic, like every word is a name, right? And particularly in Hebrew. So in English and in Indo-European languages generally, root words tend to be nouns, right? Like our language, and therefore in some way like our cognition is like about objects, right? But in Hebrew and in Arabic and other Semitic languages, and I recently learned in many, but I assume not all, Native American languages, root words tend to be verbs, which gives you this much more sort of like animist cognition, right? So like Shin Lamed Mem, right, which is the root of shalom, the Hebrew shalom and the Arabic salam, both of which means peace. It is also the root word of Solomon's name, right? You can hear the slum in it, right?
Oh.
His name means Shlomo, his Hebrew name means peacemaker. Remember I said he was famous as a peacemaker. So like that root, the deepest root of that word is to set like the sun, to go down like the sun, right? And it's because like from there, right? It's also, by the way, the name of a large number of different Semitic gods of sunset and of Venus evening star, right? So like, yeah. So like, yeah, like Shalem and Salem, and also the town name Salem, like the one in Massachusetts is named after one in the Bible.
Ooh.
And that is that same word. And Jerusalem, Yerushalim, is also that same root, right? It's because, you know, at sunset, that's the time when rest happens, right? Like you're done with work, and so it's time for rest and time for peace. And that's like, that's the relationship. That's how you get from sunset to peace in a root word sense, right? And that kind of etymology in Hebrew, like, really lends itself to like a word-based magic, right? So, and that's what the Pentacles are, right? The Pentacles are not, even though we talk about them as planetary, they're not astrological magic. Like they have astrological features. And even though some people are really concerned about like what metal they're written on or like what kind of ink and etc., like they're not primarily a sympathetic or material based magic. You know, like I said before, I don't really like to categorize things, but when, you know, we need to do it in order to talk about them. Right. And so Agrippa lays out these three categories of magic that he calls natural magic, right? Which is like plants and rocks and the magician and stuff that's going on in your body too. So like body-based energetic magic is all in that natural magic category, right? And so I think of that as like matter magic. It's magic about matter, right? And then we have this, what he would call celestial, what we would call astrological magic, right? Which really has to do with time, right? And then we have this third category, which he calls divine magic, right? Which I might even call like abstract magic. It's just magic that is bound in neither matter or time. It's like the other category, right? And the Pentacles are primarily in that category. They're like word magic. They're magic about ideas, right? They occur in, you could say like, you know, this is a little fuzzy around the edges and I don't want to get too like, I'm happy to nerd out in the comments with anybody who wants to well actually on this, because there's a lot of well actually I want to do to it too. But like it's magic that occurs in like a world of platonic forms and ideas, right? And that's not exactly what I mean, but like in that idea, like neither matter nor time. And that's the kind of magic that these planetary pentacles are. They're made out of words and names and abstract spirits, I guess.
Yeah, like the transcendental or something.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so for that reason, like it really matters what the words are. And there's this really robust, like well-developed Hebrew and Jewish, but like not all Hebrew magic is Jewish magic and not all Jewish magic is Hebrew magic. The Pentacles are unquestionably Hebrew magic, and they're also very similar to a lot of Jewish magic. So I think they're probably Jewish magic. Right. And so like the names, because magic isn't forbidden in Judaism, you know, these divine names, we have like, there's a lot of just written sources about like how these names work magically, and the book sort of lays a lot of that out.
Okay, cool. Okay, so you're situating your work. You are building on this kind of misfit thing in Mathers. He just has these pentacles and he's not able to like, he doesn't have any commentary on them and they're just kind of there in between.
I mean, I don't want to say he didn't know any more about them, but he didn't put any more in the book.
Yeah. So you're kind of within that tradition. And so maybe you could help me with this just a little more before we get into this.
Sure.
So the Lesser Key of Solomon is a series of books, one of which is the Ars Goetia. Yes?
Yes, but to be clear for listeners, right, the book I am talking about that the Pentacles are in is not the Lesser Key of Solomon, it's the Greater Key of Solomon. Then there's this other book, which is substantially later chronologically, called the Lesser Key of Solomon, which contains a number of books, one of which is the Ars Goetia.
And then, so why do you, or what is it about like, well, I guess Agrippa too does use Goetia, and you use this, it's a Greek term. So there's like this
Sure.
overarching thing, which I think of like Goetia as demons. It's like if you're doing Goetia, you're doing, there's something different than like theurgy or mysticism, like you're kind of getting dirty or something. That's like the connotations it has.
I think that is certainly what Goetia means when Christians use it. That is to say, in like medieval, in Renaissance, in Western Europe, that is definitely what it means. But like in ancient Greece, right? So the root of Goetia means to like howl or to like wail, like so at Greek funerals still today, right? At very traditional Greek funerals, you sometimes hire old ladies to come and like wail dramatically over a coffin. Like it's part of a funeral, right? Is this wailing, right? That job, like the person who does that is also what we would call a witch. Like that's just part of her job is the wailing. She does other stuff
Yeah.
historically, right? That's Goetia, like the kind of magic that person practices, right? Which is a very sort of spiritual magic as opposed to like a material magic. So that person, right, is in Agrippa's terms, that person is going to do primarily that like divine magic and some natural magic, right? As opposed to like some other kinds of magical practitioners in ancient Greece, like a mage, which is a word imported from Persian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or well, from some kind of Indo-Iranian language, right? Which is primarily doing like astrological magic, right? And as opposed to like pharmacopoeia, right? What we would call maybe witchcraft, which is really very rooted in natural magic, right? And so Goetia really just means like spirit magic in ancient Greek. But, you know, at least by the late medieval times when that were like when the Ars Goetia is written, like there's no middle ground in Christianity, right? Like spirits are either holy or they're evil, and there's no other category and no other way to categorize them.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the Ars Goetia is spirits that Christian priests don't approve of. Like,
Okay.
that's what Goetia means in that context. But Goetia, as a, like, the Ars Goetia is a particular manual inside a much larger category of Goetic magic, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense.
Again, sorry to be like so nerdy and technical about everything today.
Okay. No, I think it's helpful. Because like, yeah, so essentially what you're saying or what I'm hearing is that there's like a stigma. There's like
Yeah.
a stigma, and it's coming out of like Christian propaganda.
Well, yes, but I would say at a deeper level, it is coming out of like Christian theology.
Hmm.
Like, like it's hard to a kind of Christian cosmology, like a cosmology compatible with Christianity, right? You're sort of always going to get that kind of dualism. Like it is in its core kind of a dualistic faith,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I'm not like hashtag not all Christians or whatever, but I'm just saying like central Christian doctrine is pretty dualistic,
Hmm.
right? And if you're practicing magic in a dualist system, you're going to end up with a dualist magic,
Yeah.
right? Where you have like good guys and bad guys and they're at war with each other. But that's just not how I understand the world. And it's not how like the overwhelming majority of humans throughout human history have understood the world.
Mhm. Yeah, I think dualism is a particular philosophical frame that some people
Yeah.
take.
Right.
And yeah, and things tend to look dualistic when you look at them through dualistic frame.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So yeah, the Ars Goetia is definitely like very traditional like demon conjuration.
Mhm. So it's demon conjuration. And like what would inspire someone to explore this type of magic, or what inspires you to
Well,
what inspired you to get into it?
so for me, it was a very natural outgrowth of like other kinds of magic, right? So I often say that like I didn't really start in magic so much as everybody starts off as a magician, and then most people get it beat out of them by the time they're like 6 or 7. But I feel like if you talk about magic with a 5-year-old, they're gonna be like, yeah, obviously you can talk to a tree and make friends with a tree. Everybody knows that. Like, right? Like I think animism is actually like the natural state of humans, and then children are taught to not be that way. right? And that didn't happen to me,
Yeah,
right?
can I pause you there
So
real quick?
sure.
I'm curious because this is kind of interesting because the way you're talking, I'm kind of wanting you to define
Mhm.
magic because the way you're talking about it with animism, I'm getting that relational sense. So how would you define magic?
So I think it's really hard to define because, again, like in English, we do not have a technical vocabulary. So just like in English, the word soul is going to refer to something that in many languages, particularly older languages, you're going to have a whole host of different words. Like Hebrew has easily 5 or 6 different words, right?
Mhm.
And so does Greek. And I would imagine so do many other languages that I don't know, right? And I think magic is in that sense similar, right? That like remember I was distinguishing, like making these fine distinctions between lots of kinds of magic. When
Mhm.
English, we just don't have a robust vocabulary for that. But I think broadly, when I talk about magic, I am really talking about an operation you perform like here in the material world that causes some change in the invisible world, and that thing that happens in the invisible world causes an effect in the physical world, and the causal chain of the relationship between the physical actions here and the physical results is obfuscated, occulted,
Mhm.
right? And it's occulted because it's occurring in like all the parts of nature that are invisible to most humans,
Cool.
right? And I think that what is and isn't visible like varies between different people, and that's partly a matter of like, I don't know, I would assume biology, right? Like just like some people, like clearly like a gift for mathematics or a gift for music runs in families, and so does a gift for magic, right? But just like math and music, like there's a lot of other things, there's a lot of practice and learning of technique and hard work that goes into getting good at it. Similarly with magic, right? That it's like a broad body of techniques, the same way mathematics or music is a category of techniques for doing specific things, right? And so magic is like a kind of a technique for doing things, and the things that you are doing are mostly happening in the invisible world, which we could call the spirit world or etc. I just I think part of the dualism that's in our culture is we tend to think of like a material world and a spiritual world as 2 different worlds, but they're not. There's just like one world, and some of it is visible to us, and we call that kind physical, and some of it is completely invisible to us, and we call that spirit. But like, they're not like that's a thing about humans and not a thing about the world. And it's even a thing about individual humans. Like some things that appear to be invisible to other people seem really quite visible to me,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't know, like I'm not ghosts don't seem as invisible as they're supposed to. Like, oh, I don't know, I can hear them right now, you know? So, and I think, so that's how I think about magic, right? Is really like categories of techniques that interact with the invisible world, right? And you can get more technical about it and make really fine distinctions between what's magic and what's science, which is kind of a blurry area, and what's magic and what's art, again a blurry area, like what's magic and what's religion, a blurry area. Just like actually the boundaries between art and religion or art and science are also quite blurry when you're actually in the thick of them,
Yeah.
right? So it's a little hard to find, but that's basically what I mean by magic, is like interaction with the invisible world that is intended to produce specific physical results.
I think there's something about it because, like, you have an interesting definition. I really like it. It's lighting up for me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and it's somewhat similar to the famous Crowley definition, art
Yeah.
and science of making changes in conformity with will. I think it's something like that. And
Yeah, I think he focuses a little bit too much on will, personally.
yeah, yeah, because you're bringing, but there is something about the magician's intent that seems
Sure.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, but I think a lot of times people swing too far that way. Like, I think that there is a like idea in pop magic, right? I think that beginners in magic who are learning in our culture, a mistake that many beginners make, which I understand why they make it because people are telling them to make it, like, is that like intent or will is like the only thing that matters, but that is like just obviously false. So sometimes I will see things like, oh, you can substitute rosemary for any other herb in magic. And I'm like that's just as ridiculous in magic as it would be in cooking. I
Yeah.
think cooking is a really good metaphor for magic in a lot of ways, truthfully.
That's why I really like your definition, because it's bringing into, well, the thing that led us into this is, I think one
Mhm.
thing that I really appreciate about your work and how you talk about it is the relational aspect. And then
Mhm.
really highlighting that there is a change going on, but there's a world, there's a occulted world that we're interacting with and relating,
Yeah.
and that's important. And that is what is fueling the change.
I think that the problem with like the reason I think it's a mistake to like get too caught up in the like will or intent aspect is because I see a lot of beginner magicians who think like the way they think about magic is that the magic is entirely inside of them.
Mhm.
And that magic is really good for making changes inside of you. So for like healing yourself and like dealing with psychological and spiritual and even physical trauma, like inside yourself, that works great. But if your magic is entirely inside yourself, it's actually quite hard to get results outside of yourself, which is an important part of magic, right? So some people will propose like a model of magic, sometimes called the psychological model, where really all magic is doing is like changing you inside and changing the way you perceive things. And I just think that like that's a sad way to think about it because it makes magic really small and not that useful. I mean, not that it's super useful for lots of stuff, but it's just not useful for things that aren't you. And I have lots of like most of my stuff I'm doing in the world isn't occurring only in me. It's about my relationship to other things. Right. And I think that when you get real hung up on will and intention, right, you miss that relational aspect. And then I think on the other side, I think historically, right, so like for example the kind of Renaissance grimoires I'm talking about, I think they focus too much on the outside aspect where it's
Mm.
all the spirit and there's like no talk about like your inner state. I mean, there's a little bit, but like I feel like they don't have enough focus on like the internal part of it. And so they are also missing that like relationship aspect. But I do think that it's about like a relationship between the magician and the world, just like most things that humans do are about a relationship. It's the same way with art, right? I sometimes see art where like it's pretty clear to me that that person made art that like the only person they were communicating with in that art was them, and that's cool. Like art, I also make art that's just for me, but that's a different thing than the kind of art that moves other people, which is about a relationship. Like it's about art as a communicatory mechanism, like a mechanism for putting one human in relationship with other people and spirits and ideas and the world around them, right? And I think that like anything, I think like the magic here, I just mean in like a metaphoric sense, like the sweet spot for most human endeavors is actually in the relationship between, as Buber would say, the philosopher Buber, I and thou, like
Mhm.
me and the big thou, you know?
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so yeah, the model thing is interesting. And so, yeah, again, to speak to Crowley, kind of infamously labels the Goetia as aspects of the human brain.
Yeah, I honestly just think that that is like not only false, it's like dangerous. I
Mhm.
think it's exactly the same as telling somebody like LSD is an aspect of their brain, but like it's not. It's an outside thing that is changing the way your brain works, but it's definitely not all in your head. There's like a genuine physical thing occurring that is not entirely about you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess one question, and this kind of circles to something I wanted to ask you
Mhm.
about, so earlier, circling back, so Solomon as exorcist or
Mhm.
healer. And so we have some interests on the channel in mental health. And
Mhm.
I guess like differentiating, like what do you think? Okay, I've got a couple questions on this, but the first one is what what if any use is exorcism for contemporary mental health issues in your, I guess
So
this is
I
kind of complicated, but
all
just
right.
in
So
let's say wellness and
yeah,
mental health, just for wellness.
let me preface all this by like not only am I not a mental health professional, like I don't think of myself as a healer. I'm also not primarily a spiritual healer.
Okay.
Like I am primarily a teacher. Like when we think about like different roles, there's like the magician as healer and the magician as teacher and the magician as artist, and I'm very squarely in the magician as teacher aspect, right? Like the more wizardy end,
Mhm.
right? Um But I think that broadly in our culture, in a way that I actually think everybody understands, like mental health and physical health and also spiritual health, but I'm going to put that one aside for a second. Like they're obviously related, right? So I think a lot about like PTSD as like a way where I think it's like maybe quite easy to see the relationship, right? Whereas like for example, like the places where I have PTSD, I also have like physical injuries from the traumatic event. And the like mental damage from that thing and the physical damage from that thing and the spiritual damage from the thing, they're all woven together. So I don't think you can like fully separate them, right? But I think that there's like different kinds. So I'm going to use a lot because again, because we don't have good words in English, I'm going to use a lot of like metaphors about physical healing to say what I'm saying. And I think that just like there's different kinds of physical injury, right? There's a kind where something inside of you is broken, but it's like kind of a clean break and you just have to set it and it will heal itself as long as you like keep it clean.
Yeah, regeneration.
Right. But there's other kinds of like ways to be physically ill that are about a foreign intruder being inside of you.
Yeah.
Right. And I think for the most part, like humans have most humans have a pretty robust immunity against germs. Like we're swimming in germs all the time. When do you get sick? You get sick when like your immunity drops, right? You're cold and you're tired and you're stressed out, or like you have an open wound or whatever, right? Like your natural immunity is somehow lessened. And that's like you were exposed to those germs all the time. It's when like mostly, right? And when it drops down, like that's when you start to get sick from it, right? Not with everything, again, like in very broad terms. And I think it's the same with like our mental health and with our spiritual health, right? But I think in our culture, like when we have a physical trauma, like a broken arm, for most people, it gets attended to pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I think for mental and spiritual trauma, like we just don't. We just let it fester until it's like a huge problem, right? And then you have to like dig it apart. So I think exorcism is a really and look, I don't I often use the word I was taught to use the word extraction instead of exorcism. And I do think like the word exorcism has like a lot of baggage around it that makes it hard. So like when we're extracting things, it's because there's something inside of us, like in a spiritual sense, that isn't us and it shouldn't be there. Right. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. I will say for me, like the most common kind I see, which again, I'm not a healer, so I get kind of fringier cases sometimes. Like these are the ones that get referred to me by other magicians. But for me, like when people, I'm just going to preface this, like I'm not telling other people how to believe, but I'm struggling to find words without it sounding really didactic. So like, I'm just saying this is how it seems to me. When people die badly, that is to say, scared and in pain and afraid and alone. Like, we all know what, even if we can't put exact boundaries out, we know what it means to die badly. Mm-hmm. When people die badly, sometimes I find that their spirit, again, the only thing I can say with surety about what happens after we die is that anybody who tells you that they know for 100% what happens after you die is lying to you to try and manipulate you. Like, I don't know what happens after we die, but I mean, I sometimes talk to dead people, so I have some opinions on the matter, right? And I think that it's just like our physical body, like is a very complex combination of lots of complex systems working together. They're held together by this ephemeral thing called life that we don't really understand, right? And that when life ends, those pieces start to come apart. And some of them, like our breath, just dissipate. They're not us, basically immediately. And some of them, like our bones, they like retain our us shape for a long time after we die. And I think it's the same with the immaterial, the invisible parts, right, of a person. But I think when people die badly, those parts don't always decay in a good way. They come apart almost like shrapnel. And like those pieces can like get stuck in things. And that's what we would call a haunting, right? When it's stuck in a place or an object, right? But when it's stuck in a person, which I actually find to be more common, like it's sometimes called a possession. And I find for me personally, the kind I think that happens most when the person is physically present when the bad death happens and like intimately and emotionally connected to the person. So like a family member, or a family member in a very broad sense, right?
Yeah.
And there is like a complicated quasi abusive relationship between those two people. So I will see in my practice, the most common exorcism I do is shards of people's dead abusive parents that are like stuck inside of them, and like there's a piece of a dead thing inside of you like festering as it shouldn't be there, right? But in our culture, again, people don't, especially our culture is so fucked up around death and grieving that
Mhm.
like almost nobody gets like what I think of as like appropriate spiritual care when they're grieving. And so these things can kind of fester, and that can lead, and that can is often tied up with a lot of mental problems and a lot of physical problems, right? But I think like you kind of have to work on the physical and the mental and the spiritual all at once, but like you can start kind of with any of them, right? So I find that those extractions often open up space for like psychological healing and mental healing, just like and physical healing, just like physical healing open up space for spiritual and mental healing opens up space for physical and spiritual healing, right? But that's I think of as the most common exorcism I do, right? Is shards of dead people that are stuck inside someone like shrapnel,
Yeah.
decaying, and because it went untreated for so long, it started to like fester and cause all kinds of other problems. Whereas like if you get to it right away, it's like not as big of a deal.
Yeah.
Like any kind of physical injury, you know what I mean? Like even a pretty bad physical injury, as long as you get it tended to quickly, it'll heal. But if you get all kinds of like dirt and shit in the wound, it'll fester. And I think it's the same with spiritual trauma.
Yeah. Oh, there's two things I want to talk about
Mm-hmm.
based on the reflection. The first, the first I got excited about because I think
Sure.
it's pretty brilliant. I think you really helped me understand something. So that we've got so in my work, working in therapy, there's
Mm-hmm.
this aspect of we have an innate healing capacity.
Right.
Sometimes the body is just actually armored against it, and it's
Mm-hmm.
loosening the body up and allowing the healing to happen and just
Yeah.
giving permission to heal. And that could be like one aspect. But then there's this other aspect, which is maybe like a foreign invader,
Yeah.
something. And I can really co-sign what you're saying about the shrapnel because I primarily work with heroin addiction, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of bad deaths.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it seems that there's some kind of sympathy. Well, in the Tibetan tradition, they talk about hungry ghosts, which I've looked at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It seems like there's like and I see it when I
Mm-hmm.
wake up. Sometimes there's like this gray, and I
Yeah.
try on the longest night to work with it. But I think it's really affecting us a lot.
I think so. And I will say the people I find who like honestly have the most like sort of spiritual, this is such a bad phrase for this because it sounds really victim blamey and I don't mean it that way at all, but like the most like spiritual pollution, it's people who work in like addiction recovery or like in mental health facilities or in prisons where they're just around like a huge amount of misery and a huge amount of like mentally and spiritually and physically unstable people. like like working with addicts, I imagine you get cursed all the time. Like even if they're not intending to curse you, like it's just a thing that angry broken people sometimes do. They like evil eye people, right? And so I do think that there's like this miasma, right, that like you can wade through. And so what I'm saying about like a normal healthy immune system will protect you, I think when you're in those really like miasmically dense environments, like I think you need some additional stuff there, you know.
Yeah, ask Venus and just try to do a lot of banishing. And then it's funny you say the thing about the curses. Like
Mm-hmm.
one thing that I think helps me is I have this weird method where I don't fight the addiction.
Mm-hmm.
I like will be like, oh, what is this doing? Because I think one of the reasons people are getting cursed in my field is they're trying to stop people from doing something they want to do, which is not like how I frame it at all. It's just like,
Mm-hmm.
but
I think it's that, but I also think that like people in pain just tend to lash out at everything around them, you
yeah,
know.
Yes, it's quite interesting. Interesting.
Because it's true, people who work in emergency rooms also get cursed all the time.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And they're like, you would think that nobody's cursing the person who's like setting their broken arm, but I will say, when things hurt, you just curse everything in the vicinity. You know, especially we live in a culture of cursing.
Mhm.
Like people just curse really casually in our culture.
Mhm. Yeah, and actually, this is a good segue. I want to tell you,
Sure.
one of the reasons we're having that I wanted to talk to you, and we were
Uh-huh.
doing episodes on magic, is because I had this kind of epiphany. So I had in what with Western psychology would be called eating disorder, bulimia,
Mm-hmm.
and I really um diligently worked the CBT system,
Mm-hmm. Is that
very
cognitive behavioral therapy?
cognitive behavioral therapy, and
Mm-hmm.
then I got into magic and dream work and had a few healing insights that just really rapidly accelerated my healing process. And I just feel like
Mm-hmm.
as professionals, it's unethical. I feel unethical withholding information I know that could potentially be helpful to someone who's suffering. And I trying to make ethical arguments.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, that's one reason I'm talking to you because I think you're like a really brilliant mind in the field of magic
Thank
and
you.
learn. And okay, you've been very generous with your time, Sarah.
Oh, I
I'm
mean, you
really,
know,
really grateful. I'm really enjoying it.
thank you so much for having me. I'm enjoying this too. Like honestly, I do a lot of these interviews and it's sometimes just like the same questions over and over. So this has been a delight.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad my, wandering, highly open questions without any central thrust is pleasurable for you.
Well, I am also a wanderer. So.
Yeah, because it's also very pleasurable for me and interesting. Let me see if I have like one. There's a traditional wrap-up question, which I'm kind of trying to linger because I want to stay with you, but I guess I'll ask the final question, which is how can we help you and support your work? Like if we want to get involved with you in your practice and support and help you, like where can we buy the book? Where can we learn about your amazing courses? Like that kind of thing.
Awesome. Well, I have a couple books out. Honestly, the easiest way to like find me is to just put Sara Mastros in quotes into Google. Like Mastros, my family name is an unusual name, so I like the first many pages of results will be me. So I have a couple of books out. I will say for of my books, right? I think Orphic Hymns Grimoire is the one that is in some ways like the most approachable, right? It's rooted in Greek mythology, which I think like actually most people in our culture are like more or less familiar with. And it's really mostly like a devotional and sort of spiritual work. It's got poems and pictures, and it's in little chunks, right? Each hymn has its own piece. I also have a book on magical incense, which is,
Ooh.
I think, yeah, like so. And, you know, I say it's about incense, but it's really about any kind, it's about the magic of plants, really. Right. And I talk about them in terms of incense as opposed to talking about like potions or oils or something, because I just think incense is like the easiest kind of potion to make from like a crafting standpoint. So the first half of that book, I go through a lot of different like plants, and just like I was trying to do, I was saying with the pentacles, like I try to explain like why they are the way they are. Like I talk about, I don't know, more than 100 and less than 150, I would say, individual plants. And I talk not just about like what their magical virtues are, but about like what features of the plant lead me to know that. So for example, I know that any plant that is an abortifacient, like anything that will induce an abortion, will be sacred to like witch queen goddesses. So like pomegranates, for example, are a sacred sign of Persephone and pomegranate. And I know that they're going to be sacred to those like underworld queens because they have this abortifacient property, or like pennyroyal, right? And I think that's really important for those of us who are working like in particularly in the Northeast United States, where like a lot of the indigenous traditions about the plants are genuinely lost, right? Like you can, if you know about like the biochemical, the visible properties of a plant, right? Which are partly about, you know, its role in the ecosystem and partly about like its biochemistry and those things, you can reconstruct its sort of spiritual properties from that. And when you do that, in places where there is an indigenous tradition, you will find that you get the same answers, because like spirit is in some sense an old-fashioned word for chemical. That's why we call alcohol spirits.
Yeah.
Right? Like it can mean a lot of things, but that is one of the things. So like when you want to know what the spirit of a plant is like looking to its biochemistry is where you learn that. And so the incense book is a lot like that. And then the second half of the book is recipes, where I talk about like, now that you know all these individual pieces, here's how you can put them together in lots of ways. Because I always find it really frustrating when I'm like looking at a magical recipe and I'm like, why does this have peppermint in it? That doesn't make, like, I don't understand. And there is some reason, but the author didn't tell me. So I really try and articulate very clearly like why I chose each ingredient. Right. And that I feel like is the core of the work I do, is explaining. Like I said, I'm that teacher kind. And so that's what I'm doing in courses as well.
Ooh. So we'll go to Google and search you, and then we'll also.
It's also witchlessons.com.
That's a great domain. How'd you get that? Well, you get.
Magic. Yeah, I don't know. Luck and magic. Like I looked for, I mean, I will say I tried a couple, which classes was already taken, which courses, but magic is, I think, the answer to how I got it. So witchlessons.com, you can find all of my stuff. But primarily, I think that the best way to interact with me is in courses and lessons and teaching, right? So there's some on YouTube you can see for free. I do it in person all the time. So for local people, I'm actually teaching a tarot workshop at Owl Hollow on Saturday.
Oh, nice.
Oh, sorry, not this Saturday, the Saturday after, the 27th. And then I'll be teaching at Convocation in Ann Arbor, Michigan in late February. And then in suburban Baltimore at the Sacred Space Convention in March. And then in Ohio at Wellspring at Tradera in May. And then in Birmingham, England in June, and in Italy in July. I really missed in-person events during COVID, so I said yes to everything. But now when I look at my calendar, I'm like, oh no, what have I done? Like, it's a lot of travel for me.
We'll have like a little crew following you around, like a concert or something. Like
that'd be great if I had like deadheads. That would be amazing. That would be amazing. Please make that happen. And then I also, I teach online courses right now. I'm teaching Introduction to Witchcraft, which is good for beginners to magic, but really it's also really good for people with like a more intermediate practice who just like want to see. Sometimes I feel like sometimes your practice goes stale and you just like want to reinvigorate it with some new viewpoint. And objectively, honestly, half to 2/3 of the people in my introductory class have been practicing magic for years, but it is still very approachable for beginners. And then I have a course based on this Pentacle book, right, called On Planetary Pentacles.
You know what? I did get the book, but I'm gonna go get the incense one, because I think what you're saying is really interesting. Like, I feel like it's a great platform and a safe way to like experiment with magic, because it's actually helps me flesh out your definition of magic, which is about making, so like if there's a certain quality that we need to bring in, we can match that with your incenses, right? Or your and then make and help us make that change in the spirit world, like connect through that spirit. Like, let's say
it's partly about connecting with the spirits of the plants themselves, but another great use for incense is, I think it's sort of like, I think of different spirits, especially like we were talking about, like phonic demons, underworld demons, or like high heavenly spirits. Like Earth is not their natural habitat. And I feel like incense, one of its primary uses is to sort of create a bubble of habitat that is like more hospitable to a certain kind of spirit. And that helps them like bridge the gap. So there's a kind of magic where you travel to the spirits. But I think for beginners, it's, I don't know, a different kind. I don't know if it's easier or harder. It's a kind where the spirits are traveling to you, and incense helps create like environment more hospitable to that.
Yeah, I like how I heard Steven Skinner said like they don't actually like the smell. It's like it's helping like make the smell better. Like he was like very literal with it. So like
I think so. I mean, that's a very traditional take that especially angels find it's like Vulcans on Star Trek. They like find our human odor very off-putting.
Like, oh, that's like so sweaty and like human. Like
I mean, I get that. I will say, like, natural humans get kind of smelly for me too. You know what I mean? Yeah. After a while. But yes, that is one very traditional. And then also, of course, there's a every incense is also a drug. Like there's a like
Oh,
frankincense,
wait.
for example, produces very reliable and measurable changes in human brain activity,
Oh, cool.
as
Oh,
do every other plant you eat or inhale or interact with in most ways. Like there's like also a chemical
so there's like
thing that it's doing.
psychoactive,
Yeah. I mean, not always psychoactive, but like bioactive.
bioactive.
But frankincense, I think, is definitely psychoactive.
Excellent. So we'll get that book too, and then join some
Awesome.
courses
I
and
hope you like it. Well,
organize.
I will say also for local people, all my courses are free for Allegheny County residents. Because look, we didn't talk about this today. Maybe I'll come back and talk about this more. Like for me, I really think of my like great work right now is about building community. And
Wow.
so like people who are actually here and like will be of help to me when the grid falls, I'm gonna like build a real community, and then I charge people out in internet land in order to be able to do that community building work here.
I'm trying to think of what I'll help you with when the grid falls because like I'm trying to put together the
Is it that part where you're a mental healer? Because I feel like the apocalypse is going to have a great need for
yeah,
therapists.
yeah, yeah, as long as it's a couch.
Gardening also, I'm a big believer in
Yeah.
building.
The building, that's what I'm talking about. I was just struggling all day to put this chair together, and it was really speak. You were talking about like struggling. It was like that
I'm
for
I'm not, I was a mathematician for a long time. I'm quite
oh,
like, yeah. Before I quit to be a good for nothing, I was a theoretical mathematician. Um, I mean, in between, I was a high school math teacher for many years, but first I taught university math and then high school math, and then I quit to do this, whatever this not a job is. I love it. Um, but so I'm quite like science minded, but I am not mechanically gifted at all. I'm like things like putting together chairs. I'm actually genuinely terrible at it.
yeah. So we'll have someone else, you
Well, I
know.
got a lot of like engineer and plumber and electrician friends, but I do feel like, I do feel like sometimes my apocalypse circle is real heavy on healers and artists, and maybe we could use more like
Be like
electricians and gardeners. I got a lot of gardening too, but like carpenters and electricians, I feel like we could use
in
more of.
building.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Those
Well,
seem like
thank
very high value
yeah.
skills.
Get them in the. We'll try to reach out to some of our builders and get
I
them
have
in.
some. Yeah.
But yeah, I want to thank you again, Sarah, and thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I really had a great time.
And we'll definitely have you back on again before
Awesome.
20 years when everyone
Please
has agreed. What
bring
was
me
it?
back in the spring and we'll talk about like local spirits and gardening and that kind of magic.
Okay, deal. Deal.
Awesome.
Okay, bye, friends.
Bye.